Did you look today?
No, I'll sexy that.
Just talking about.
Okay.
I have one.
Yeah, let me get your tip. So last time we were talking about consumerism, and I had to read that Veblen article. For those of you who had to read that at home on your own, how did that go? It's hard, huh? Yeah. Yes, yeah, we're all about like comparing yourself, basically keeping up with the Joneses, right? And his whole idea is that we aren't actually spending money because and buying things for our own comfort, or when we are, that's very rare. More often we are buying stuff because we want people to see us buy that stuff, or they want to see we want other people to notice that we are rich or we are like them because of the stuff we buy. And he was saying also that you can flip that idea and you can say, we not only assume that good people will make a bunch of money, but we assume that people with a bunch of money then are good people. So it kind of like flips that way. So one of the reasons that we buy all this nice stuff then is to show somebody, hey, we're good people. Not just we're rich, but we're honorable and we work hard and we have good values and so on. So I think that Veblen stuff and that stuff about consumerism can fit into a lot of your essays in terms of like adding sources to your papers. I also think the stuff that we're going to do today is going to apply to a lot of your different essays about the American dream. Before I move on, did anyone not get an American dream packet with all the sources in it? Raise your hand. Down, Keegan. Alan. Jay, did you get one of these? Great. Yeah. 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 Okay, anyone else? All right. Okay, so today we're going to add to this with another couple of sources that you can potentially use, and then at the end of class we're going to practice what that is like to add sources to your text. So first, to get into this topic, we have to clarify the differences between these two words. So we've got two ideas here between equity and equality. I bet in other classes you have talked about equity versus equality. Is that fair to say? No? Well, good, you're gonna learn something. So there's two ways that we try to make sure that people are kind of on the same level in society. You can either do that by promoting equity or you can do that by promoting equality. So equity is when you are trying to be fair and impartial. Equality is when you are trying to see everyone as equal. So equity is when you are like, I want to make sure that everyone has the same chances. And equality is like, I want to make sure that everyone is seeing the same, valued the same. Equity is when you are treating people according to their needs. So let's say somebody has like a learning disability, for example, and another person is like an advanced learner. In an equitable system, you would give the person with learning disabilities kind of like extra support so that they could have the same opportunities as the person who is like, high achieving, right? So this is where we like in school, this happens all the time. Like if you get more time on a test, for example, it's because the equitable position is to say, oh, well, this person has dyslexia or something like that. And so we want to make sure that they are not like hindered by this disability and that they're doing their very best. Equality, though, is if you see everyone as the same, everybody gets the same opportunities, right? So it's like everyone gets 45 minutes to write this essay, regardless of like who you are, everybody is the same. And then in this case, you're thinking about like the individual needs of each person then, because you're wanting to meet those needs. And with equality, you're not necessarily thinking about individual needs, you're thinking about like how to make sure that every single person is ensured the same chances. So they are appropriate in different circumstances. This is a famous like little cartoon that educators will use a lot, but also in other systems as well. So it kind of illustrates this idea. In reality, some people are born into difficult circumstances, right? Some people are kind of just like the average. They've got like some support. Maybe they've got a solid family structure that is helping them get as many opportunities as they can. But they're not necessarily born with like crazy amounts of wealth or, you know, connections to all politicians or, you know, just a super high genius IQ. They're just sort of like average middle income, right? Some people got all of those things, all those nice fancy things that help give them this advantage in life. I think like regardless of like political persuasion where you are, like we recognize that some people are born lucky, you know, because yeah, I recognize that. And some people are born just sort of like average. And then there's this idea that some people are just born really, really unlucky. I've been reading this book called Invisible Child. Has anybody heard about it? So it won the Pulitzer this year. And it is about this girl who is like extremely bright, but she is growing up in Brooklyn with two parents who are totally unstable. So her parents are just like in and out of like rehab for heroin addiction, and they're going from homeless shelter to homeless shelter and so on. This girl is really bright and she's also really athletic. So like whenever she tries out for a team, even without any formal training, she's always the very best on the team. But then the next month, her parents get into more trouble and she has to move away from that team and start all over again. So it's this idea that like, regardless of, you know, who she is as a person, she was born into this circumstance that was just very unlucky for her. So that's kind of reality with inequality. Equality is where, okay, everybody gets a chance. Everybody has the same sort of leg up. You know, everybody gets the universal income, or everybody gets like our stimulus check. Everyone gets the same amount, right? Equity is where you're like, all right, well, this kid was born tall, so he doesn't need anything. This kid was born short, so he needs a couple boxes, and this kid is going to stay the same as what he was. So it's like making sure that people kind of like all kind of achieve similar results. So this one is similar supports, this one's similar results. And then wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to think about this at all, because everybody just got similar chances from birth and it was a utopia, you know? And that would be like an example of like just being completely liberated. All right, so that's the system people are talking about. And again, there's different scenarios where equity is more appropriate or equality is more appropriate, or honestly, reality is more appropriate and so on. It would be great if we were all liberated, but that's also just utopia. So that's the idea. You've got your American Dream packets, but I forgot to put one thing in there. So I'm going to give you the short story. We're going to read a short story today about this idea. Has anyone read Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut? All right, so repeat. We're going to read a source about the dangers of equity. And then we're going to read a source about a guy who said that every man was a king, and we should get tons of help for the government. So it's hopefully we're getting both sides of the political argument. All right, I think I want to do story time for this. Hang on. Yeah, I think I'm going to read it to you. I guess if you want. All right, so I'm going to read this story to you, and while I am reading the story, I want you to keep your thesis for this upcoming paper in mind. You kind of have it in the back of your head, like, oh, I am arguing about whether or not the American dream is individualized, or I'm arguing about whether it's possible, or I'm arguing whether competition is a good idea, because I think so many of your thesis statements apply to this story. And so while I'm reading, this is yours to keep. I want you to write on this paper and mark up anywhere where you think you see any kind of relevance to your argument. That way you won't have to come back to it and reread it to find portions that you could potentially. No. Okay, ready? Okay. So this is Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. The year was 2081 and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the HG men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything, except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was turned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about. On television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic like bandits from a burglar alarm. That was a real pretty dance, that dance they just did, said Hazel. Huh? Said George. That dance, it was nice, said Hazel. Yep, said George. He tried to think a little about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good, no better than anybody else would have been anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked so that no one seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did 2 out of the 8 ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer, said George. I think it would be real interesting hearing all the different sounds, said Hazel, a little envious. All the things they think up. Said George. Only if I was handicapper general, you know what I would do, said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapper general, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers. If I was Diana Moon Glampers, said Hazel, I'd have chimes on Sunday. Just chimes, kind of in honor of religion. I could think if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe make them real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapper general. Good as anybody else, said George. Who knows better than I do what normal is, said Hazel. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son who was now in jail, about Harrison, but a 21-gun salute in his head stopped that. Boy, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it? It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor, were holding their temples. All of a sudden, you look so tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot and canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. Go on and rest the bag for a little while, she said. I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while. George weighed the bag with his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me. You've been so tired lately, kind of worn out, said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and just take out a few of them lead balls, just a few. 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out, said George. I don't call that a bargain. If you could just take a few out when you came home from work, said Hazel. I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around. If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people get away with it. And pretty soon we'd be right back to the dark ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? I'd hate it, said Hazel. There you are, said George. The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society? If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to this question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. Reckon it'd all fall apart, said Hazel. What would, said George blankly. Society, said Hazel uncertainly. Wasn't that what you just said? Who knows, said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first as to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had a serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, and in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, ladies and gentlemen. He finally gave up, handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read.
That's all right, Hazel said of the announcer. He tried. That's the big thing. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard. Ladies and gentlemen, said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. And she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was a warm, luminous, timeless melody. Excuse me, she said again. She said, and she began again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive. Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a grackle squawk, has just escaped from jail where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete, is under-handicapped, and should be regarded as extremely dangerous. A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen, upside down, then sideways, upside down again, then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween in hardware. Nobody had ever worn heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the HG men could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick wavy lenses. Spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him wanging headaches besides. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people. But Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. And to offset his good looks, the HG men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random. If you see this boy, said the ballerina, do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him. There was the shriek of a door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen jumped again and again as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, and well he might have, for many was the time his own home had danced to the same crashing tune. My God, said George, that must be Harrison. The realization was blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George could open his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hand. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. I am the emperor, cried Harrison. Do you hear? I am the emperor. Everybody must do what I say at once. He stamped his foot and the studio shook. Even as I stand here, he bellowed, crippled, hobbled, sickened. I'm a greater ruler than any man who had ever lived. Now watch me become what I can become. Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bar of the padlock that secured his head harness. The bar snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber ball nose, revealed a man that would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. I shall now select my empress, he said, looking down on the cowering people. Let the first woman who dares rise to her feet, claim her mate and her throne. A moment passed, and then a ballerina arose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the mental handicap from her ear, snapped off her physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last of all, he removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. Now, said Harrison, taking her hand, shall we show the people the meaning of the word dance? Music, he commanded. The musicians scrambled back into their chairs, and Harrison stripped them of their handicaps too. Play your best, he told them, and I'll make you barons and dukes and earls. The music began. It was normal at first, cheap, silly, false, but Harrison snatched 2 musicians from their chairs, waved them like batons as he sang the music as he wanted it played. He slammed them back into their chairs. The music began again and was much improved. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weights to their toes. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, camboled, and spun. They leaped like deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutralizing gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in air inches below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicap general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the emperor and the empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them that they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergeron's TV tube burned out. Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone out into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with the beer, paused while a handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. "You've been crying?" he said to Hazel. "Yep," she said. "What about?" he said. "I forget," she said. "Something real sad on television." "What was it?" he said. "It's all kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. "That's my girl," said George. He winced. There was the sound of a riveting gun in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," said Hazel. "You can say that again," said George. "Gee," said Hazel, "I could tell that one was a doozy." All right. So you, in your little groups that you can work in, groups of 4 or 5 would be okay. It's okay even if you want to do this with a partner. I want you to talk for a second about whether this is a representation of equity or equality. Okay, talk about that for a minute.
And I don't know what people are just like voting like I do understand.
Ripped on like thousands.
Okay, so once you've decided if this is equity or equality, I want you to talk about what the story's attitude is towards equity or equality. So you're trying to figure out the theme. How does the story feel about equity or equality? Okay, go for it. Talk.
It's not something.
And also at the end they get shot too, like yeah. They get shot and then like overall like tone.
Yeah, they want it.
There's so many folks. It's like so they're like so they
Yeah, one person from your group, raise your hand so I can pass out a piece of paper to draw on. And so if you're not part of a group, now's the time to get in your group.
Wait, what do we need?
Need a piece of paper for your group.
Oh, yeah.
All right, I showed you the images, like a really famous image. There's been like different versions of it, but a really famous image of 3 people trying to watch the baseball game and getting different supports based on whether it is equity or equality, right? I want you to now add to that image. This is the Harrison Bergeron version of equity or equality, and you're going to draw an image on your piece of paper with your group about how he would represent that concept. Make sense? So it's the future society, how they see equity or equality. Okay, so draw a little image.
It's so good looking those drawings.
It's church bells, you know?
Oh, sure, yeah.
I can see every product. That's like the lighter.
Yes, sorry if that was confusing. The
It's like the
story's point
rising,
of view
like they're
of
looking at
equity or
black people.
equality. So it's like, this story is obviously critical of this idea of equity, right? Here we are, like, putting handicaps on people so that they can't achieve what they are innately capable of. So what would the story represent that picture of? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, modify the picture to be what the story represents. It's okay.
What? I can't draw the best one when I got those.
Uh-huh.
Not that pretty.
I don't know, because they're making like. No, but equity gets on the same level. Equality, everyone gets the same. This equity, because. Oh, so it's. So.
Oh, we don't.
Like, you know, all have the same amount. They all have the same amount.
Did it explode?
No.
Yeah, you're so.
I read it. Okay, it doesn't need to be a great artistic project. It just needs to be a representation. Awesome. So who's done with their little drawing? Okay, if you're done, I'm gonna have you come and do your little drawing up here on the board.
Whoa, your hair's so curly.
Bouncy.
Oh!
It's
Just
good.
Hey, is that my stuff? Can you just left it?
No, that wasn't me. That's Maggie.
No, it's not. It's not that hard to bend over and pick it up. Aiden has some left.
You have like a lady that translates.
Oh, he ate it. Okay, nobody else needs to come up and draw there.
No,
Got it.
I'll draw it.
You can go. Watch this.
Where's the markers at?
Oh. Same idea. I don't know how to draw. I just don't draw bars.
Yours isn't good?
It doesn't look good.
What I like about the story is that it's stealing. Have you seen the like? I'm trying to say like that. I haven't seen one. That's a good one though. I just did liver holes. I kind of like a legs are off. How do you like draw someone's legs off?
You just draw them without legs. Not that hard.
Well, no, he has legs. Oh, I don't need to just do that.
You need a red marker.
Blood.
I need different
Super gory.
Here you go, JD. This will help.
I'm actually Daddy, so thanks for that. I'm gonna have to tell her that.
Where did JJ go?
Jenny,
Jenny, what were you saying?
this blood.
Hey, Jamie, that's salty ingredients.
Milk bottle flip.
There's
That
always a
was
salty,
fastest.
the salty ingredients. You act like 10 ounces.
1 minute.
You're trying the baseball field.
Yes.
My fastest is like
Like what?
Too good. I was a little ins- No. Do we need this?
Your little picture? Yeah, for a second.
No, no.
All right, 10 more seconds to finish your drawing.
Is it poisonous?
No.
We get it, right?
Yes, I get it. All right.
Oh, that guy's like
Okay, sit down. Let's refocus. Okay. So I think what we are seeing here that is in common is that the book is seen as, rather than as a way to like give everyone a step up the story, everyone gets a step up so that they can see over the fence. It's more seeing it as a, like, how can we ensure that nobody can see over the fence, right? And everybody is equally unhappy, and through our mutual unhappiness, then everyone will get along.
I was gonna get there.
Oh my gosh, eventually.
So historically, this story came out in the 60s. Historically, this story has been used by the political right, like quite a lot. So like conservatives or Republicans, it's been used by that sort of like political spectrum to say, look, we shouldn't have government programs. What do you think about that reading of this story? Accurate, not accurate? This is this one right here is actually a pretty common version of how we could look at equity. Instead of giving everybody a chance, it actually hinders the strongest people from being able to achieve. What do you think of that idea?
In terms of like in the aspect of conservatism or just the story in general?
I guess I kind of opened it up for either. Yeah, so either.
I think like the idea that like the story was trying to get, the like conservatism in general kind of takes, but then they take it like too far to the point of saying there should be no government at all. It's kind of saying that like if you can look over the fence, good for you, but you can't, that's too bad.
Yeah.
And so I think like the idea that like everyone should be able to look over the fence is a bad idea. People try and use the story as an excuse to like argue that if you can't look over the fence, you need to fix that for yourself.
Okay, good. So you don't see this story as necessarily being like pro individual like growth to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get yourself over that fence.
Kind of.
Okay. Their ideas. Yeah, Kaylee.
I feel like this story is more like when government help goes too far versus government help at all. Because this is a very, very extreme form of government intrusion in people's life.
Yeah.
And so by saying this means government shouldn't help at all, I feel like this isn't the right example of that.
Okay, how do we get an idea from this story, just right from the very beginning, first couple of paragraphs? How do we know that this is about government interference at all? Yeah.
We talked about that it's constitutional.
Yeah, and it's the 211th, 12th, and 13th constitutional amendment, right? So what Kaylee is saying about this like extreme form of government interference, yeah, it's like gotten to the point so far that it's become absolutely ridiculous. He's using it as a joke here. Okay, good. Jackson, you had a point about it.
Something I was thinking was also what we were talking about about is their version of equity is like what happens when there's someone below that, like when they're below the line.
Yeah.
Instead of building someone up, it's lowering the bar more.
Yeah,
So, for
okay, good.
example, when you lower the bar more, to do that, you have to know the higher people on the bar down.
Right, so it's like prohibiting genius from being able to flourish then. So then I want to ask, is it surprising to you at all to learn that Kurt Vonnegut called himself a socialist? Yes, no, maybe so. And that this was partly in response to the House of Un-American Activities Committee and how they were on the hunt for communists, and people in like the 50s, especially in Hollywood, were losing their jobs, losing their livelihood because they were considered communists, or they were called out for being communists. He said that partly this story is in response to that. Yeah, Gavin?
Like obviously.
Right.
communists and socialists and all that.
Right.
And I think it's like kind of like you guys think
Okay, so that could be part of it, is that like by making this idea of government restriction so extreme, he's actually kind of satirizing what the right thinks of the left, potentially. Hippies loved this story. Hippies like thought that this was like the coolest story about counterculturalism. So in part, I think that this story is definitely about how certain like restrictions placed on us could potentially like dampen our potential. In part, it's just an anti-conformity story sort of in general, like let people sort of live up to their fullest potential.
I think I kind of get from this is kind of a take from the rich to give to the poor. But if you look at that graph there, I'm also thinking that in our society, we have that mentality, and yet we don't take from the highest or the elite or brains represented there. Instead, we take from the average common people's strength, and then we give it to beauty, and then that
Oh,
creates
interesting.
dependency. So it's an attempt at take from the rich, give to the poor, but we still leave like our Hollywood elite in our very high people society with more than everyone.
Yeah, or the handicapper general here who gets to make all of the decisions. Yeah, I think it's really interesting in this story too, how the one individual, the one who can escape all the handicaps, actually does end up being a super dangerous person who is just going to kind of like crush things and say, I'm emperor now, I'm going to take control of everything. And if you follow me, you can be a duke or an earl, like you could be part of the aristocracy, you know, and lead with me. So it also has this little snippet in it about how much people do want to seize control. So I think it's a little bit more complicated maybe than at first glance, but I think it can be really useful source when you're talking about inequality and how to kind of like think about the American dream. I got another source for you for this. So open up your American Dream packet and find Huey Long, Every Man a King. I don't remember what page it's on. Does it have a page? 49. All right, Huey Long was a politician from New Orleans, from Louisiana, who was running for president in 1934, I guess. Yeah, in 1934, as a socialist Democrat. He was responding to issues in the Great Depression, and he was thinking, this is not fair, the world that we live in, and he has a bit of a proposal here for how to potentially fix problems of wealth inequality. So I am going to, it's not the best writing ever, I'm going to read parts of this to you. So we'll just start at the beginning. It's necessary to scale down the big fortunes. Is that a right of life when the young children of this country are being reared into a sphere which is more owned by 12 men than it is by 120 million people? Ladies and gentlemen, I have only 30 minutes in which to speak to you this evening, and I, therefore, will not be able to discuss in detail so much as I can write when I have all the time and space that is allowed me for the subjects. But I will undertake to sketch them very briefly without manuscript or preparation. You could tell that it's without preparation sometimes. So that you can understand them so well as I can tell them to you tonight. I contend, my friends, that we have no difficult problem to solve in America, and that is the view of nearly everyone with whom I have discussed the matter here in Washington and elsewhere throughout the United States, and that we have no very difficult problem to solve. That we have no very difficult problem to solve. It is not the difficulty of the problem which we have, it is the fact that the rich people of this country, and by rich people I mean the super rich, will not allow us to solve the problems, or rather the one little problem that is afflicting this country. Because in order to cure all of our woes, it is necessary to scale down the big fortunes that we may scatter the wealth to be shared by all of the people. We have a marvelous love for this government of ours. In fact, it is almost a religion, and it is well that it should be, because we have a splendid form of government and we have a splendid set of laws. We have everything here that we need, except that we have neglected the fundamentals upon which the American government was principally predicated. How many of you remember the first thing that the Declaration of Independence said? It said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that there are certain inalienable rights for the people, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it said further, we hold the view that all men are created equal. Now, what did they mean by that? Did they mean, my friends, to say that all men were created equal, and that meant that any one man was born to inherit 10 billion, and then another child was to be born to inherit nothing? Did that mean, my friends, that someone would come into this world without having had an opportunity, of course, to have hit one lick of work, should be born with more than it and all of its children and children's children could ever dispose of, but that another one would have to be born into a life of starvation? That was not the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, when it said that all men are created equal, or that we hold that all men are created equal. Nor was it the meaning of the Declaration of Independence when it said they held that there were certain rights that were inalienable, the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Is that right of life, my friends, when the young children of this country are being reared into a sphere which is more owned by 12 men than it is by 120 people? Is that, my friends, giving them a fair shake of the dice, or anything like the inalienable right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or anything resembling the fact that all people are created equal, when we have today in America thousands and thousands and millions of children on the verge of starvation in a land that is overflowing with too much to eat and too much to wear? I do not think you will contend that, and I do not think for a moment they will contend it. Okay, now go 2 pages in, find the page, it says 591 at the bottom. That starts, now we have organized a society. Now we have organized a society, and we shall call it Share Our Wealth Society, a society with the motto, every man a king. Every man a king, so there would be no such thing as a man or woman who did not have the necessities of life, who would not be dependent upon the whims and caprices and some Latin of the financial martyrs for a living. What do we propose by this society? We propose to limit the wealth of big men in the country. There is an average of $15,000 in wealth to every family in America. That is right here today. We do not propose to divide it up equally. We do not propose a division of wealth, but we propose to limit poverty, and we will allow to be inflicted upon any man's family. We will not say we are going to try to guarantee any equality or 15,000 to families. No, but we do say that 1/3 of the average is low enough for any one family to hold. And there should be a guarantee of a family wealth of around $5,000, enough for a home, an automobile, a radio, and ordinary conveniences, and the opportunity to educate their children. A fair share of the income of this land, therefore, to that family, so there will be no such thing as merely the select to have those things, and so there will be no such thing as a family living in poverty and distress. We have to limit fortunes. Our present plan is that we will allow no one man to own more than 50 million. We think that with that limit, we will be able to carry out the balance of the program. It may be necessary that we limit it to less than 50 million. It may be necessary in working out the plans that no man's fortune should be more than 10 million or 15 million. But be that as it may, it will still be more than any one man, or any one man and his children and their children will be able to spend in their lifetimes. And it is not necessary or reasonable to have wealth piled up beyond that point, where we cannot prevent poverty among the masses. Another thing we propose is old age pension of $30 a month for everyone that is 60 years old. Now, we do not give this pension to a man making $1,000 a year, and we do not give it to him if he has $10,000 in property, but outside of that, we do. We will limit hours of work. There is not any necessity to having overproduction. I'm gonna go, and I think last little paragraph that I want to look at is on the next page. It just says, those are the things we propose to do. Every man a king, every man to eat when there is something to eat, all to wear something when there is something to wear. That makes us all a sovereign. All right, this guy, Huey Long, was talking in 1934. Does he remind you of any modern day politician? I think it's almost like repeated. Doesn't that sound like Bernie Sanders to you? 12 men than it is by 120 million men. Like, it just seems like it's kind of that same idea. but you know, back in the day. So I want you to talk together again. You compare this to Harrison Bergeron. What does Huey Long think of the idea of equity? How does he kind of plan to solve this problem of equity equality? Okay, discuss.
But we're so good. And like limit like the wealth to
All right, I want you to talk about one more thing. What do you think are the strengths of his plan, and what do you think are the weaknesses of his plan? Strengths and weaknesses of Huey Long's plan.
You only get one.
It's a lot of, yeah, it's a lot of stuff.
So I do like Madeline.
Okay, on your Canvas page, find this assignment called In-Class Assignment Incorporating Quotations Worksheet. I just published it, so you might need to refresh.
Everyone's trying. You guys are doing this level.
All right, so when you write these American Dream papers, you're going to have to use outside sources. That's why I've given you the American Dream packet. It's why we read the Medlin, why we're reading these things, is because I'm trying to give you a bunch of sources that I think potentially could be relevant to your argument. So when you are incorporating sources into your writing, there's a few ways that you can go about that. One, you could just straight up quote the source, right? If you straight up quote the source, it kind of looks like this. And it just has a little block of text from somebody else. But there can be issues with that when you are writing. Let's say you have like a big long idea, like Huey Long, let's say you want to quote his entire paragraph, whether to support your argument or to tear down his argument, either way. Let's say you want to quote that whole thing. That's asking a lot for your reader to read that quotation. Do you guys ever read stuff for class and suddenly you come across a big block of quotes and you just skip it? Does anyone else just skip it? I never read them. Like even when it's your writing, I hate to tell you this, but when you have a big block of quote in there, I don't read the quote. Because to me, it feels like a little bit of a waste of time because a good writer is going to tell me how that quotation is incorporated into their argument after the block. And so I'm like, why should I even read this?
Also, though, it just requires a lot of brain work on your part when you're a reader. Have you ever read a novel and you're just like, love it? You're just flying along. Let's say it's Harry Potter, right? And you're like reading 100 pages a day. And then, I've never read a novel. And then you go to pick up a different novel. Let's say you got to read Great Gatsby for school. And suddenly it's like hard to get into that other author's voice because you've been with J.K. Rowling for so long. That's what you're asking your reader to do every time you switch between a quote and your own prose. So it can be asking a lot, and there can be better ways of doing this. So quote is an option if you really want to exactly get what that person just said. It's an option, especially if your source is extremely credible and you're wanting to show that they kind of back you up, then that can be a really great way to do. You can also just paraphrase. Paraphrasing is useful when the idea is important, but not the actual words. You know, if you're just trying to get an idea from the source, but like for Huey Long's, for example, a lot of the stuff that he said, it wasn't very well written. It was kind of like repetitive. I don't know if you noticed as you were listening, and he kind of is rambling a little bit. It's probably not that important to capture his exact words. It's probably more important to capture the kind of idea that he is presenting in that little paragraph. And so paraphrasing can be a really good way of doing that. But the overall best way to incorporate quotations into your writing is a mixture. Short quotations plus paraphrasing. This is when you are only taking a few words out of the quote. Maybe the couple of words that describe a concept. Like let's say you're reading a psychology paper and there's a couple words that like describes what that disorder is called, you know? You could use that as a quotation and then the rest could be in your own paraphrase. Or maybe they just say something really beautiful, like that every man a king is a pretty great little quotation. So maybe you only quote every man a king, but then the rest is your own words. That makes your reader do a lot less work while they're reading through your paper because it makes it feel like the quotation is just a part of your own prose. So that's what we're going to practice here at the end of class. I've got this worksheet I want everyone to do just digitally, where you're incorporating quotations into your own sentences. And of course, because I want to make it so hard, I'm making you do some from the Thorstein Veblen stuff. So what you're going to do is you're going to read the quotation, but as fast as a person makes new acquisitions and becomes accustomed to the resulting new standard of wealth, the new standard forthwith ceases to afford appreciably greater satisfaction than the earlier standard did. All right, what do you think the idea is in that sentence? What is he saying in your own words? Yeah, Kaylee? You said, right? Okay, so I'm going to put it in my own words, and then I'm going to look and I'm going to say, what are some phrases in this that seem to be really important to his idea? And I really like the way that it is worded. So let's see. I like acquisitions. And I like greater satisfaction. Thank you. So here I've tried to incorporate a couple of his quotations into my own prose, and look how smart it makes me sound to be able to do that. That's another thing we like to do here, is make ourselves sound smarter by incorporating a few quotations from the writer. And then at the end, we're going to add our in-text citation. Like that.
In-text citations, hopefully this is something that is very familiar to you because you did it last year, but it's last name, page number. Okay, so I gave you some examples up here for how to do it. I have an example for where I use the author's name and an example where I don't use the author's name. And I want you to try to do this yourself. I'm going to delete this now. For these 3 quotations. One is Huey Long. The other 2 are Veblen. All right, any questions about this assignment? Try and get as far as you can in 10 minutes. I want to make sure that you at least get 2 of them done in the next 10 minutes. Okay. If you had me last year, we did almost this exact same assignment, so it's further practice for you. Not with that. Raise your hand if you have any questions. I can come help.
Just for me, because I gotta.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Do we need to write different types or not?
You just need to write 1 for each number. Sorry.
Thank you.
How many of you finished your sentence for the first number 1? All right, number two's a hard quote, isn't it?
I don't understand what any of.
Totally, let's break it down. What does it mean that propensity for purposeful activity and that repugnance for all futility of effort?
Why is it a wedge here?
Yeah, why did you just like,
Because he's trying to impress all of us, right?
I'm not impressed.
What does it mean? What does propensity mean? Do you know? Look it up. Yeah, Dash.
It's a natural tendency to behave in a particular way.
Okay, awesome. So he's saying man has a natural tendency to be purposeful in their activity. What does repugnance mean? Disgust. Yeah, exactly. And man is disgusted by not being purposeful in their activity. So basically he is saying man wants to work hard. Man wants to work effectively, but he is a part of a naive communal culture where the dominant note of life is the unanalyzed and undifferentiated solidarity of the individual with the group. What does it mean that there's solidarity of the individual with the group? What does it mean to have solidarity with the group? You guys know what solidarity means, right? Look up solidarity.
All the same, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you have solidarity with the group, he is saying that in like our communal culture, in our culture where everybody wants to belong to a group, we have unanalyzed and undifferentiated solidarity. So basically he's talking about similar stuff to Harrison Bergeron. He's saying everybody wants to fit together. And so the man who wants to be like a good, hard, effective worker doesn't abandon that when he is part of a naive communal group. So basically it is saying, in my own words, it is saying that man by his nature is a hard worker, but the group keeps him down. That doesn't mean that he loses his nature. Does that make sense? Kind of. Okay, I'm part of a friend group. I'm a hard, good worker, but when I get in my friend group, everybody wants to distract me and be fun in class, and so I don't do my hard work. But he's saying at my core, I am still a hard worker. As soon as I get out of that lazy group, I'm going to be able to be myself again. Saying groupthink crushes the individual, but the individual at its core still has possibilities. Okay, raise your hand if you got 2 of the sentences done. I need 2 of them. Okay, awesome. If you've got 2, at least submit it. You're good. And we will talk more about how to incorporate these quotes into our paragraphs next time. Okay.